Tadi yang bunyi Pak. That one save already, right?
Play.
Saved, right?
Yeah.
Perfect pula ni.
Kalau takut kamera yang ada yang tak save, kena klik save.
One dot red.
Dah.
I don't know whether they're born that way or they maybe acquire the skills along the way, but it's becoming increasingly important.
Yes, so communication skills, sometimes called people skills, sometimes even called soft skills, are really increasing in importance in the workplace. And it's for a number of reasons. I mean, certainly, as a lot of tasks get automated, the sorts of tasks that people have changed. A lot of people have to work in teams nowadays. The role of people in delivering value by an organisation has increased. And I guess just the whole issue of relationships, be it in customer service or between managers and their staff, all really depend on people having good soft skills, good communication skills.
And yet there are a lot of reports which say that some of the weakest areas for managers, for example, are their people skills.
Indeed, and that's why it's so very important for people to have a good way of being able to actually develop and improve their communication skills.
Now, you've got 7 steps for people to improve their communication skills.
Indeed, and this is anybody who needs to identify either a broad range of skills, or it may even be that in, say, a performance appraisal, they've been told, you're not a very good communicator, you need to develop. So anyone in that sort of situation can follow my 7 steps, and I can absolutely assure them that they will improve their communication skills if they follow each of these steps.
Okay, so what's the first step?
Okay, well, the first one is that you need to actually come up with a checklist of what are the communication skills that you want to develop. Now, it may be, as I said before, that you've done a performance appraisal, you've received some feedback that you specifically need to improve the way you resolve conflicts, or maybe you need to make better presentations. On the other hand, it may be that you've just been told you need to communicate in a broad sense, improve your communication in a broad sense.
One of the major skills that a lot of managers get told they're very poor at is listening.
Now, in fact, you and I have come up with a sample checklist of 20 communication skills, and they really come under a number of clusters. For example, there are what we could call core communication skills, and these are things like explaining clearly, effective listening, as you just said, is very important, communicating without words, which is about body language, and interviewing. Under team skills, which is terribly important, communicating in a team, how do you go about building a team up? How do you run meetings, as I said before, making a presentation to a group? There's a number of skills that I've put under the heading personal effectiveness, and they are things like, how do you make a winning first impression in dealing with other people? How do you empower yourself? Certainly, how do you go about making sure that you are assertive when you communicate? And how do you influence other people? Say if you're in a selling role, for example. There's another heading called leadership, and they're things like coaching on the job, productive counselling, empowering people. And finally, a lot of communication skills have to do with handling difficult people. So dealing with conflict. Maybe sometimes you have to mediate disputes, say, between 2 staff members. How do you handle difficult people and personalities? How do you give bad news? How do you conduct a discipline interview? So that's just one way of coming up with a checklist, which really is your basis for thinking about, well, what are the skills that I need to develop?
That's really good. It's very concrete, because a lot of people are very waffly about, well, you need to improve your communication skills, but what? What are we talking about?
Exactly. We don't even know where to start. So if you come up with a list, or you make a particular list that is relevant for you, that's what you want to actually work on. That's your starting point.
Okay, so I've got my list. What's my next step?
Okay, the next thing is you need to get some feedback from people on those particular skills. So what I suggest is identify a number of people who you work with and actually go through your checklist with them and ask them for feedback. What particular skills do they think you do well? What particular skills on your checklist do they think you don't do so well? So you're really trying to ask some questions So questions like, what do I do well, what don't I do well, how could I do this differently, how could I do this better? Give me an example of when I haven't used this particular skill well.
One question I guess you could ask that's interesting is asking your manager, for example, you've seen a lot of people do really well. What do they do that I'm not doing?
Exactly. You really want to try and get feedback about how you compare with other people or how you compare with how things should be. So that'll give you some really useful data. And from there you can then go on to the third step of my approach, which is, I guess, really compile a summary of the skills that you need to develop in the area of communication. There may be some things that you do really well. Okay, terrific, you don't need to develop them. But there may be 3 or 4 skills on that checklist that you developed that have really been identified from the feedback that you've got, the skills that you need to develop.
Okay, so we've got a checklist, and presumably it's going to be better if it's in writing, and you've got the feedback, and you're going to look at what you do better.
That's right. So you're going to really have a summary of your skills that need developing. Now, I think a really interesting question that you can kind of tag onto this is the question, if I use this skill, what would be different? Now, that really kind of gives you a bit of a feeling for, well, why is this skill so important? So, for example, let's say one of the skills that I've been told I need to develop is presentation skills. So when I'm making a presentation to a group, that's something I really need to improve on. If I ask the question, well, if I have this skill, if I use this skill better, what would be different? It might be that the feedback that I get from people in groups that I present to is going to go up. I'm going to get 5 out of 5s instead of 3 out of 5s. It may be that there's a greater chance that people will actually buy the product. Let's say I make a presentation that essentially is selling. So whatever it is, you need to try and get a good handle on what would be different out there in the world if I actually had this skill. But of course, if you can't answer that question, you've got to ask yourself, well, why am I developing the skill? Who cares? So it's a very useful question to ask.
Okay, so the next step we're obviously going to look at how we develop these.
Precisely. So we've done our checklist, we've got feedback, we know, okay, I need to zero in on these 3 or 4 skills. Then it's really a matter of finding the suitable developmental activity in order to develop the skills. Now, it might be going to some particular workshop, it might be in-house, it might be an external course, it might be looking at a video, doing some sort of e-learning activity.
And maybe even observing somebody who's really good, or being told, look, you really need to watch the way Jan operates because she's very good at managing meetings.
Absolutely. And, really when you think about kids, what's the way in which kids learn? They learn through observation. So you're absolutely right. Direct observation of somebody who's really good at it is terrific.
Okay, so what's the 5th step?
Okay, so once you've gone through your coaching, your course, your video, whatever the learning is, I think it's very important for you to get back out there in the real world and actively experiment. Try out your new skills in the designated situations, whatever they are. So if I've been told that I need to listen more, I need to try, experiment with this active listening technique. If I need to change my body language when I'm dealing with a customer, I need to consciously experiment, try it out. Now, I think one of the things about this is that it often is going to feel very strange to people. And I like to use the analogy of, when you're used to driving a car on one side of the road, and then you go to a country where they drive on the other side of the road, you feel very strange, you feel very you feel very some of those skills that I've learned. So that can be another way. But somewhere along the line, you've got to get out there and